I was standing on my porch just after sunrise when HOA Karen decided my farm road was her personal drag strip. She didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, didn't even pretend to wonder whether the land she was tearing across belonged to someone else. Her white luxury SUV came screaming through my dirt road at a speed no sane person would use near livestock, crops, or human beings. Dust exploded into the air behind her tires like she was filming a commercial instead of committing trespass. The sound wasn't just loud, it was aggressive, the kind of engine roar meant to announce dominance. I watched the road I built with my own hands shake under her wheels as if it had personally offended her. Corn stalks snapped, gravel scattered, and the quiet I'd earned over decades was ripped open in seconds. Then, just as she passed the fence line, she lifted one manicured hand off the steering wheel and waved at me. Not an apology, not surprise, just a casual wave. The kind you give when you believe nothing can touch you. That wave told me everything I needed to know about who she thought I was. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? HOA. Karen didn't see a farmer, a landowner, or a boundary. She saw an obstacle she expected to flatten. I didn't shout after her, didn't raise my arms, didn't chase the cloud of dust swallowing my morning. I just stood there with my coffee going cold in my hand, watching her disappear back toward her gated community. That was the moment I understood this wasn't an accident or a wrong turn. It was a pattern announcing itself. By the time the dust settled, the road was scarred with fresh tire tracks cut deep and deliberate. My cattle shifted nervously in the pasture, heads lifting in unison the way animals do when danger passes close. I walked down the road slowly, each step pressing the truth deeper into my chest. Someone had decided my land didn't matter. Someone had decided my road was faster than respecting property lines, and that someone was about to learn how expensive that belief could become. Less than 24 hours later, she came back. Same time, same speed, same white SUV charging across my farm like the rules of the world stopped at her bumper. This time she cut even closer to the fence, close enough that one of my steers bolted hard enough to snap a wire. I stepped into the road and raised my hand, forcing her to slow just enough to roll down her window halfway. Her sunglasses hit her eyes, but her smile carried no confusion. She told me, in a voice dripping with certainty, that there was an easement and that everyone knew it. When I told her there wasn't, that this was private land, she laughed like I'd just misunderstood my own life. She said maybe I bought the wrong property and drove around me without another word. That was when I stopped seeing her as reckless. That was when I started seeing her as deliberate. Every morning after that, the same engine tore through my road like clockwork. She honked sometimes, sharp and short, as if announcing a victory lap. The road became a racetrack, my land a shortcut, my silence mistaken for permission. People online like to joke about farmers solving problems with shotguns. HOA Karen assumed I was too old, too quiet, or too rural to do anything at all. She never once considered that patience can be sharper than anger. I didn't stumble into a quiet life by accident, and I didn't inherit it from anyone who handed it to me clean and easy. Every inch of that land had been earned the slow way, through years that left calluses where comfort used to be. Long before HOA Karen ever discovered my road, I had already learned what patience cost, and what it returned. The farm wasn't a backdrop or a lifestyle accessory. It was the result of decades spent waking before sunrise, fixing what broke instead of replacing it, and understanding that land remembers how you treat it. I knew the shape of that road the way other people know their own handwriting. I knew where the gravel settled, where rain carved grooves, where livestock crossed, and where tires didn't belong. When I stood on that porch watching her SUV tear through, I wasn't defending a shortcut. I was watching someone tear through the structure of a life built deliberately. I had chosen that land precisely because it wasn't governed by committees or neighbors with clipboards. No bylaws taped to mailboxes, no fines issued for the wrong shade of paint, no strangers measuring grass like it offended them personally. Out there, responsibility was direct. If something failed, it was my failure. If something held, it held because I built it too. That road wasn't decorative. It was functional, meant for tractors, feed trucks, and the slow rhythm of farm life. Speed had no place on it, and neither did entitlement. I had worked too long and given too much of myself to mistake that difference. Authority doesn't always sound loud. Sometimes it sounds like restraint. When HOA Karen laughed at me and drove around my warning, I didn't escalate because I didn't need to prove myself to someone who measured worth by convenience. I knew what she didn't yet understand, that people like her confuse silence with weakness because they've never met someone who knows how to wait. I had outlasted droughts, equipment failures, and seasons where nothing went right, no matter how carefully I worked. Compared to that, one arrogant neighbor in a white SUV wasn't a crisis. She was a test. Every morning she came barreling through, she confirmed something I already suspected. This wasn't about access or confusion. It was about control. She wanted the fastest route, and she expected the world to move out of her way. The farm, the cattle, the man who owned it, all of it was supposed to yield because yielding was easier than resistance. She assumed rural meant passive, and old meant tired. That assumption became her foundation, and foundations built on arrogance always collapse the same way. I had spent enough years dealing with reality to recognize patterns. People who respect boundaries adjust the first time they're told. People who don't push harder when they're challenged. HOA Karen didn't hesitate, didn't apologize, didn't check her paperwork. She relied on confidence alone, the kind that grows when no one ever stops you. I didn't interrupt that confidence. I let it grow. Authority doesn't need to announce itself. It only needs to be documented. By the time the second week passed and the road bore the scars of her routine, my response was already forming. Not anger, not revenge, but structure. I knew exactly how this had to unfold if it was going to end cleanly. I wasn't interested in shouting matches or confrontations that ended in accusations. I wanted an ending that didn't rely on anyone believing my word over hers. I wanted an ending that spoke for itself. That's the difference between people who live under rules and people who build lives. I wasn't going to argue with HOA Karen. I was going to let her behavior speak until it cornered her. And every time she came racing through my road like it belonged to her, she added another line to the story she didn't realize she was writing. Once I stopped pretending HOA Karen was confused, I started seeing the machinery behind her behavior, and it was uglier than the dust she kicked up on my road. She wasn't just a reckless driver taking a shortcut. She was a product of a system that taught her authority was something you wielded outward, never something that constrained you. Her confidence didn't come from proof or permission. It came from repetition, from years of being obeyed by default, from a neighborhood where rules were enforced downward and never inward. The road through my farm wasn't an exception in her mind. It was a challenge to a hierarchy she believed existed everywhere she drove. Creekview's HOA had conditioned her well. Committees, fines, warning letters, and meetings where voices like hers never faced consequence had trained her to see resistance as temporary noise. She had learned that if you push long enough, most people back down. She carried that lesson out of the subdivision and straight onto my land, assuming it worked the same way everywhere. That assumption was the real abuse. Not just of my property, but of the idea that ownership meant anything at all if it inconvenienced her routine. Every pass down that road was a statement. She wasn't just saving time. She was demonstrating that her schedule mattered more than my livelihood, that her tires mattered more than my crops, that her convenience mattered more than the safety of my livestock. When the cattle scattered or the fence wire bent, those weren't accidents. They were acceptable losses to her, collateral damage in the pursuit of speed. And because no one stopped her the first time, she escalated. Faster passes, sharper honks, a deliberate closeness to the fence that told me she wasn't unaware of the risk. She simply didn't care. That's how abuse works when it wears a smile. It's quiet at first, almost deniable. Then it becomes routine, then it becomes daring. Karen didn't need to threaten me. She didn't need to shout or insult. The power move was repetition. The message was simple and relentless. I will do this, and you will live with it. Every morning she reinforced that message with the same white SUV and the same speed, daring me to make myself the problem by reacting. The HOA structure behind her gave her cover. In her world, paperwork appeared when it was convenient and vanished when it wasn't. Easements existed because someone said they did. Authority flowed from confidence, not verification. She leaned on that structure like armor, assuming that if she ever needed it, the HOA would back her simply because she belonged to it. That belief made her reckless. It made her comfortable, ignoring signs, fences, and verbal warnings. It made her confident enough to laugh when told no. What she didn't understand was that outside her gated streets, authority works differently. Out here, power isn't loud. It's documented. It's measured. It waits. The more she abused the space, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't a misunderstanding to resolve. It was a behavior to record. And the longer she pushed, the more complete the record became. Each morning she raced through my road, she tightened the net she couldn't see. By the time I fully recognized the shape of the abuse, I also recognized the mistake she was making. She believed the HOA protected her. She believed rural meant defenseless. She believed age meant slow. Those beliefs kept her accelerating when she should have stopped. And that acceleration, that refusal to acknowledge boundaries, was exactly what would bring everything down on her head without me ever raising my voice. The moment I stopped thinking about HOA Karen as a problem to confront and started treating her as a pattern to document, everything changed. Emotion stepped aside and procedure took over. I wasn't interested in being right in the moment. I was interested in being unarguable later. That shift made the work boring, repetitive, and exacting, which is precisely why it worked. I began with dates and times, not feelings. Every pass down my road was logged. Every honk, every acceleration, every near miss with livestock became an entry instead of a grievance. Patterns don't argue back, and patterns don't lie. I installed trail cameras the same way I install fencing, deliberately and with coverage in mind. One faced the bend where she entered. Another covered the stretch near the pasture. A third watched the fence line she cut too close to on purpose. Each camera stamped time, date, and motion without emotion, capturing what she assumed no one would bother recording. I didn't hide them. I didn't want secrecy. I wanted visibility. Proof works best when it isn't sneaky, because it removes excuses. If she ignored cameras, that was her decision, not my trick. Signs came next. Not the flimsy kind people pretend not to see, but large, reflective warnings placed at intervals no one could reasonably miss. Private road. No through traffic. Trespassers will be reported. I photographed every sign in place, logged their locations, and stored copies of the images in multiple places. When one was bent or knocked down, I replaced it and logged that too. Damage tells a story, especially when it repeats. HOA. Karen didn't just ignore warnings. She interacted with them, striking them with her vehicle or tools, turning neglect into intent. I took the same approach with the land itself. Flattened corn rows were photographed from multiple angles. Fence damage was measured and dated. Livestock disturbances were recorded with notes on behavior changes, stress indicators, and vet consultations when necessary. It wasn't dramatic. It was tedious. But it created a chain of cause and effect that didn't rely on my tone or memory. It relied on consistency. When I spoke to the sheriff's office again, I didn't complain. I presented dates, footage, photographs, and a clear explanation of what's happening and when. The difference was immediate. Patterns demand attention. Accidents can be dismissed. Repetition cannot. The deputy didn't promise action. She didn't need to. She acknowledged the documentation and told me to keep going. That was enough. The process had begun. The legal research followed the same path. I didn't assume anything. I read statutes, property law, and private road regulations line by line. I consulted my attorney not for theatrics, but for confirmation. Everything I planned to do had to be legal, visible, and defensible. No traps, no surprises, no gray areas. HOA Karen thrived in ambiguity. I was building something that left her none. The discovery wasn't a single moment. It was the accumulation of small certainties stacking into inevitability. Each day she drove through after signage went up, after cameras were visible, after warnings were documented, she stripped away another layer of plausible denial. By the time I finished preparing, the story was already written. All that remained was for her to read it the hard way. I didn't feel angry as the file grew thicker. I felt calm. Calm comes when you know the ending isn't up for debate anymore. HOA Karen still believed she was untouchable. She still believed speed and confidence would carry her through. She had no idea she was already boxed in by her own routine, every reckless pass tightening the walls she couldn't see. The morning it ended didn't feel dramatic at first, and that was the strangest part. There was no storm in the sky, no sense of anticipation hanging in the air, just the same pale light creeping over the fields the way it always did. I was already awake before dawn, not because I was nervous, but because I knew patterns don't break themselves. HOA Karen had never missed a weekday in months, and people like her don't suddenly develop restraint. They double down until reality intervenes. I sat at my kitchen table with the camera feeds open on my laptop, watching my road lie quiet and empty, knowing it wouldn't stay that way. When her SUV finally appeared at the edge of the frame, it was exactly on schedule. Same speed, same confidence, same refusal to slow even as the warning signs flashed past her windshield. She didn't brake. She didn't hesitate. The vehicle barreled forward like momentum itself was on her side. The first contact happened so fast it almost felt unreal. A sharp release of air as rubber met consequence. The vehicle dipped slightly, then kept going, stubborn even as the second set followed. By the time the SUV ground to a stop in the middle of my road, all 4 tires were ruined, and the illusion she carried with her finally collapsed. She climbed out furious, shouting at the road as if it had betrayed her, slapping the side of the vehicle and pacing like anger alone could undo physics. When she saw me walking toward her, her voice sharpened into accusation, not confusion. She screamed about sabotage, about lawsuits, about how I would pay for every dollar of damage. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I told her calmly and clearly that she was trespassing, that the warnings were posted, and that law enforcement had already been notified. That calm landed harder than shouting ever could. The shift came when she realized I wasn't reacting the way she expected. There was no fear in my posture, no rush to explain, no attempt to negotiate, just stillness. She pulled out her phone and started recording, announcing loudly that she was being attacked, that her life was in danger, that I had set a trap. The performance was sharp and practiced, but it had no audience left. The cameras were already rolling, the signs were already posted, the paperwork was already filed. Her narrative had nowhere to land. When the deputy arrived, the collapse became public. Her accusations unraveled one by one as documentation replaced emotion. The road was confirmed private. The warnings were verified. The inspection records were produced. Each piece stripped another layer of authority from her voice until she was left standing in the dirt with nothing but outrage and a citation in her hand. The tow truck arrived like punctuation at the end of a sentence she had been writing for months, hauling her SUV away while neighbors watched from a distance they had never crossed before. There was no cheering, no satisfaction spoken aloud, just the quiet hum of official procedure closing around her. She wasn't escorted away in handcuffs. She didn't need to be. The humiliation was complete without spectacle. She stood alone, expensive sunglasses useless against the reality settling in, while the road behind her lay empty for the first time in months. That silence wasn't peace yet, but it was the sound of power leaving her. By the time the dust settled, everyone involved understood what had happened, even if they didn't say it. HOA Karen had mistaken confidence for immunity and routine for permission. In front of witnesses, law enforcement, and documentation she could not outrun, that mistake became permanent. She didn't drive off that road again. She didn't argue her way back into control. The confrontation didn't end with shouting or victory speeches. It ended with paperwork, citations, and the unmistakable realization that her world no longer bent around her schedule. What followed the confrontation wasn't loud, and it wasn't fast, but it was relentless in a way HOA Karen had never prepared for. Once the incident became official, the machinery she had always relied on for protection began turning against her. Documentation doesn't stop working when the shouting ends. It keeps moving through systems, desks, and offices long after ego runs out of fuel. My attorney didn't posture or threaten. She filed. She submitted. She requested. Every action was procedural, and every procedure pulled another thread loose from the image HOA Karen had wrapped around herself for years. The HOA board couldn't ignore what had happened once law enforcement reports entered the record. Questions that had never been asked suddenly demanded answers. Why had one resident been allowed to claim access she couldn't prove? Why HOA funds had been used to send legal threats without board approval? Why complaints had been filed selectively and enforcement applied only when convenient? The same structure that had emboldened her now required explanations she couldn't improvise. Meetings were called, records were reviewed, silence stopped protecting her and started implicating others. Experts replaced opinions, and that transition was devastating for someone who had always relied on confidence alone. Surveyors confirmed property lines. Legal counsel reviewed easement claims and found nothing supporting her story. Financial audits began tracing HOA expenditures, and patterns emerged that mirrored her behavior on my road. Shortcuts, assumptions, authority used without accountability. Each report narrowed the space she could operate in until there was nowhere left to stand without contradicting documented fact. I didn't attend those meetings. I didn't need to. Retaliation at this stage wasn't personal. It was institutional. Once the system began correcting itself, it moved with a weight no individual could push back against. HOA Karen's voice, once decisive and loud, became defensive and uncertain. Her explanations shifted. Her confidence fractured. People who had deferred to her started distancing themselves, not out of loyalty to me, but out of fear of being tied to her collapse. The final blow didn't come from me or even from the HOA board. It came from professionals whose names carried weight and whose conclusions didn't care about personality. When experts speak, ego becomes irrelevant. Findings were delivered. Violations were noted. Recommendations were made that stripped her of authority she had never earned properly in the first place. She wasn't removed with ceremony. She was sidelined through process, the way people who rely on intimidation always are when facts enter the room. By the time it was over, the retaliation had done what anger never could. It erased her influence quietly and completely. No speeches, no confrontations, just doors closing one by one as her name stopped opening them. She didn't fight back because there was nothing left to fight with. Expertise doesn't flinch, and systems don't care how confident you sound when the paperwork says otherwise. The road didn't change after HOA Karen disappeared from it, and that was the point. It stayed exactly the way it had always been meant to be, slow, quiet, and unremarkable to anyone who didn't need it. No fresh tire tracks cut across the gravel. No dust clouds rose in the early morning light. The cattle stopped lifting their heads at the sound of engines that never came. The land returned to its own rhythm without ceremony, without acknowledgement, as if it had simply been waiting for the noise to stop. I didn't celebrate. There was no victory lap. No moment where I stood at the edge of the road feeling larger than before. The absence of her presence was enough. Peace doesn't announce itself when it returns. It just settles back in, cautious at first, then certain. Days passed without incident, then weeks. The signs stayed up, the cameras stayed on, not because I expected trouble, but because boundaries don't disappear once they've been tested. They remain, silent reminders that this place was not negotiable. People in town eventually stopped bringing her up. At first, her name surfaced in low voices, paired with disbelief or mild curiosity. But even that faded. Stories lose energy when there's no more conflict to feed them. She became irrelevant the same way she had become powerful, gradually and without notice. I didn't hear her engine again. I didn't receive another letter. The road stayed empty. One morning I walked its length the way I had hundreds of times before, checking gravel, fence lines, and the places where tires had once cut too deep. Grass had started creeping back in along the edges, reclaiming the damage without asking permission. The land didn't hold grudges. It just healed when it was allowed to. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to nothing in particular, realizing that this was how it was always supposed to end. HOA Karen didn't lose because I outmatched her. She lost because she never learned when to stop. She mistook silence for surrender and patience for weakness, and by the time she realized otherwise, the outcome was already fixed. There was no final argument, no last confrontation, no apology offered or accepted. She simply vanished from my road, from my routine, from my life. The quiet held, and nobody challenged it again.